Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the August edition of the South Florida Arboriculture and Landscapes webinar series. Um, Today's presenter is Alyssa Vinson. She is up in Hillsborough County and one of the few handful of urban forestry extension agents that are out there for the state. I think she's a board member of the Florida chapter of the ISA as well. And today she's going to be sharing everything that she has on mangroves. And so
Not
looking forward.
everything, John. That would take me hours.
Well, I mean, we're going to try and hit the key points here
Yeah.
anyway. So, but with that, I'm going to go ahead and just pass it off here to Alyssa.
Awesome. Well, I'm really happy to be here with you all today. I see some familiar names in the audience. So, hello to the folks that I know. And for those of you that don't know me, it's nice to meet you. As John said, I am the Urban Forestry Extension Agent based at the Hillsborough County Extension Office. There are only a few of us kind of scattered throughout the state. So, we love to be able to get a chance to talk to folks from all over. I am going to go ahead and get my screen share set up here and get going from the beginning. So I've given presentations about mangroves now for, gosh, close to 10 years around the southwest coast of Florida. I started out in Sarasota County and I worked in the environmental protection division there and kind of helped with the delegation of Sarasota County of the state mangrove trimming rule. And but it was before then that I fell in love with mangroves. It was actually when I was an undergrad at the University of South Florida. I got to spend about a week down at Rookery Bay doing transects with a PhD student. We were looking for affiliated plant species with mangrove propagules to determine if there were any kind of commensal relationship between the plant species that helped facilitate those mangrove propagules and help them kind of get a good start on life, whether they were shown to have any kind of benefit. And spending that time down there in and around the mangroves really changed my perspective on what they were and kind of how integral they were to Florida's environments. And so the presentation today is going to cover, we're going to talk about the ecology, the identification of mangroves, and then we're going to kind of briefly cover some of the regulations. I know that there are some locally delegated governments in South and Southeast Florida. We have a few here on the west coast of Florida as well. Pinellas County, Hillsborough County, and Sarasota County are all locally delegated governments. And so I'm not going to go into the nuances of each of the different administrative authorities, kind of permit requirements, but just kind of the broad overarching exemption criteria and things like that. And so you may have some experience, some of you in the audience, in working with your specific delegated authority on mangrove permits or mangrove projects. And I'd love at the end of this presentation to kind of get your feedback on what you've experienced in your professional life. So I want to start us out just by saying, what the heck is a mangrove, right? When we talk about mangroves here in Florida, we're talking specifically about one of three tree species. But globally, there are over 70 species that are recognized as mangroves. And you can see the distribution of the world's mangroves here in this map. You can see that they kind of stay within this band between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer around the equator. This is kind of our subtropical, tropical regions of the world. And you can see kind of an example of what we have here in Florida on the left, and then I'll show some examples of what they look like in other parts of the world as well. But for our purposes, when we're talking about a mangrove, we're talking about one of three tree species specific to our estuarine environments. And I'm going to describe them in more detail in a few slides. So they might be in the water. They might be in a landscape or in kind of a general dry upland area, or they could be in an intertidal area that is sometimes wet and sometimes not, depending on what the tide is like. So here in Florida, all three of our mangrove species tend to occupy distinct ecological niches, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Now, in other parts of the world, you might not be able to see very well on your screen what those brown lumps are in that left-hand photo, but those are actually camels. And those camels are foraging on an Avicennia species that's found in Western Africa. And so these mangroves, they actually will take the camels down to the shoreline, and the camels will forage on mangroves in these areas. If you're familiar with the Sundarbans in India, this is a kind of key habitat for Bengal tigers, and those are predominated by a red mangrove type species. The photo that you're looking at on the right is actually the state champion red mangrove here in Florida. And you can see that it is 64 feet tall. And I love to highlight this photo because when we think about mangroves in Florida, a lot of our kind of association with mangroves is that they're kind of low and shrubby, right? But that's certainly not the case, especially in South Florida. This state champion red mangrove is located in Lee County, and again, it's 64 feet tall, so much taller than we generally expect mangroves to get. Like I said, we have about 8% of the world's coastlines have mangroves, right? This is that tropical, subtropical distribution. Now we find them in low energy shorelines, so they're not going to be on our dune side where we have high wave and wind energy. They like to be in estuarine environments with brackish water. So they're salt tolerant, but they do require freshwater input. Okay, so these are areas where the salinity of the water is going to fluctuate as the tide changes and we have freshwater inflow and then we have tidal flow. They have special adaptations for salt tolerance. Some of our mangrove species will actually exclude salt, which is what the red mangrove does. It'll kind of close up its lenticels when the tide comes up high to try to prevent that salt from entering through the stems and through the roots. And then we have our other two species, our black mangroves and our white mangroves, that are what we call salt extruders, where they will actually push the salt out through different tissues, whether it's through the leaf surface or through the bark, even in some cases. For red mangroves, one of the things that we'll see over time, and it's actually critical for the buildup of detritus in these ecosystems, is that the older leaves tend to get yellow on red mangroves, and that's generally as a result of salt accumulation. So these older leaves will start to accumulate salt, they'll yellow, and then they'll drop, and they'll add to the detrital load in that environment. All three of our mangrove species here in Florida also have what's called viviparity, meaning that their seedlings actually germinate on the parent plant before they leave the plant. So rather than an encased seed that has to go through scarification and imbibition and all of that in order to get successful germination, we have propagules on the parent plant that have already begun germinating before they leave the parent plant. This allows them to be much more successful when they find an environment that's suitable for them to develop their root structures. And we can see this with our red mangrove propagules, which are the ones that look kind of like long pencils, right? Brown at one end, green at the other. You'll see a photo soon. They can actually float in the open ocean for a year before they find a suitable environment. They'll land horizontal, and then over the course of a week, they can pick themselves up to a vertical position and begin putting down their roots and growing their leaves and growing their branches. So we've been talking a little bit about the mangroves that we have, but I want us to take some time to identify them. So there are 3 protected state mangroves here on the screen, but I also have an additional species that I'm going to talk about. So we have red mangroves, we have white mangroves, and we have black mangroves. Now we also have on this slide buttonwood. Buttonwood is not a protected mangrove species in Florida, but it often inhabits the same kinds of environments. We often find it right next door, if not growing right next to a mangrove. And depending on the classification of the site that you're working in, they may also be a protected species for other reasons. So I want to talk about how we identify those as well. So in this image of the red mangrove, you can see the propagules here. White mangrove, you can see those are the propagules there. They kind of look like little ribbed teardrops almost. And then with the black mangroves, you can see the characteristic pneumatophores that come up out of the soil. They used to be called dead man's fingers, which is really macabre and spooky, and kind of love it. And so these pneumatophores allow the roots to breathe, to exchange gases in inundated soils. So here's red mangrove, or Rhizophora mangala. And Rhizophora mangala is the species that we're going to tend to find most waterward of our three mangroves. The image on the bottom left is an up close of the leaf of Rhizophora mangala, and you can see that it has a darker green on the top. It's a little bit more difficult to see, but they're bright yellow green on the bottom. They tend to be 2 to 3 inches long, but can get up to 4 inches long. They're a pretty succulent leaf, and they will have no visible bumps or salt on them. So that's the red mangrove leaf, the Rhizophora mangala. The right-hand picture is showing one of the characteristic adaptations and features of red mangrove, which is their adventitious roots. So you can see that we have roots that are dropping down from the canopy. They're reaching down into the water. Eventually they'll get covered in oysters and sponges, and then they'll eventually find the soil and they'll root in, and they allow those red mangroves kind of be an initial colonizer of new mangrove islands, where they will spread in a horizontal fashion. They'll capture detritus, they'll build soil, and then you'll get other mangrove species growing there as well. Here is the next species, which is black mangrove, or Avicennia germinans. And Avicennia germinans has a very distinctive coloration to the leaf that makes it easy to identify. You can see that it has this darker green, almost gray, green, silvery color to it. And as the tree heats up during the day, the salt that's pushed out through the leaf tissues is crystallized on the leaf surface and creates almost a sparkly look to the leaf. And this is because these leaves are slightly pubescent, and so they hold on to that salt as evapotranspiration occurs. So they're going to hold on to that salt, and then it's going to crystallize on the leaf. You can see an up close of the flower of the Avicennia germinans here, small, white, nondescript. Their seeds look like bumpy lima beans. So they're going to be about 1.5 inches long, and they're going to have a distinctive point at one end, and they're going to be kind of like bumpy lima beans. Laguncularia racemosa is white mangrove, and these tend to be furthest inland. They're not going to have any visible root structures 98% of the time. I have on a couple of occasions found white mangroves with some knobby root projections, and I think this is the result of the soil kind of slowly becoming more inundated over time due to changes in hydrology and the plant responding to that. But in general, we do not find visible root structures on white mangroves. White mangroves, again, are usually furthest inland. They have these distinctive round leaves. So you can see that the leaves are fairly round. And then in most cases, they'll also have a bit of a notch at the apex of the leaf. And then on the petiole, the little stem that attaches the leaf to the big stem, the petiole there are 2 bumps at the base of the leaf. And those are nectaries. Those actually, in previous publications from about 20 years ago, they said that those push salt out. They actually don't. The nectaries is, the name suggests, is they actually exude a sugary substance. And so it attracts pollinators to the plant. And you can see their seeds here, or the propagules. You can see kind of the remnant of the flower and that the swelling ovule there. And again, these propagules look kind of like a ribbed teardrop. So these are our 3 species that we have here in Florida. Now, to distinguish the buttonwood, one thing that I don't have on the slide, but I always like to tell people, is that all 3 of our protected mangrove species have an opposite leaf arrangement. So when you're looking down at the stem, all of the leaves are arranged opposite from each other. Buttonwoods are going to have an alternate leaf arrangement. So they're going to be at off angles. They're not going to be directly 180 from each other on the stem. They're going to be more at like 90 or 65, something like that. They're an alternate leaf arrangement. So that's the easiest way to tell the difference between your mangroves and your buttonwood. All three of our mangroves have opposite leaf arrangement. Buttonwoods have an alternate leaf arrangement. So we have these tree species, right, that live in these extreme environments. They have to be capable of handling fluctuations in salinity. They have to be able to handle influxes of large amounts of sediment. They are subject to high winds during tropical storm events. They're a highly resilient tree species. All three of them are highly resilient tree species, and they're able to kind of rebound from damage really well. But what makes them so important? Why are they protected? Well, mangroves function within the estuary as a keystone species, or some people will also call them an ecosystem engineer, right? Especially our red mangroves with those initial kind of that prop root system that builds soil. They have corals, sponges, oysters that will grow on those roots. And those roots act like a filter to capture detritus, to grab sediment as it's flowing out of the freshwater system. And it produces a very healthy and prolific kind of food web. So you can see an example of this food web here, right? We have detritus, we have microbes. There's even some really cool halophytic fungi that live in mangrove systems. So that's a fungus that actually likes to be in salt. Super cool. Mangroves provide habitat for fish, birds, reptiles, bivalves, sponges, all kinds of things that are essential to a healthy estuarine system are supported by mangroves. And in fact, 80% of all recreationally and commercially important fish species spend some portion of their life cycle in mangroves. Things like snook, things like tarpon, things like Goliath grouper, they actually start out in mangrove systems before they go out into the deeper waters and out to reefs. So they rely on that structure that's produced by the mangrove roots as a way to hide from larger predator fish. So they're vastly important from a fisheries habitat perspective. They also provide roosting habitat for critically important bird species. Some of our endangered bird species will roost in mangrove on mangrove islands and use them as stopover points during migration as well. Here in Florida, we have lost a significant portion of our mangrove shorelines. This photo is from 1973. It's an aerial image. This is Anna Maria Island. If you know this area here, you can see some of the what is now Robinson Preserve in the image, kind of central on top. And then when we kind of shift to 2015, you can see that we still have a lot of these mangroves preserved, but the land surface has changed drastically. And one of the challenges with this type of coastal development for mangroves is that we end up pinching them between human development and the water. Red mangroves can only go out so deep before they're not able to root into the substrate anymore. The tides become too high, they overtop them and they can't survive. And we can't, mangroves don't have anywhere to go when they hit a seawall. It's very difficult for them to kind of creep up and over into somebody's backyard because usually people are mowing or removing mangrove propagules or trimming them off of that area as well. So while we haven't lost as much through dredging or wetland fill as we did from kind of the period of 1948 to 1973, we've now changed the land surface so significantly that we're changing hydrology and we're limiting the plant species' ability to move inward, which is important for another reason that I'll talk about in a moment. So here you can kind of see an example of this change, right? We used to have these networks of mangrove islands in our estuaries. You can still find, places like this. 10,000 Islands is a great place to go and experience what these extensive mangrove island estuaries were like, and versus kind of what we see more often now, where we have some scattered mangroves that are associated also with seawalls. And you can see here that there's grass being maintained in this public area here. So as I mentioned, mangroves are a keystone species. They are critical to ecosystem function, and not just for the estuary, but they also provide water quality benefits that ensure healthy seagrasses and healthy reef systems. Mangroves are great at pulling nitrogen and phosphorus and heavy metals out of the water. They do a great job at erosion control. They capture sediments and detritus. And in doing all of that, they provide the necessary water clarity for seagrasses and for corals to thrive out in the marine environment. I like to call them the kidneys of the coast because of how important a role they play just in water filtration. They also provide a lot of erosion control for our shorelines. I've been in areas where I've seen a hardened seawall structure and then a mangrove shoreline, and you can see where the wave action has been slowly eroding the shoreline behind that seawall, and folks are actually losing property to the bay versus an area where there's a mangrove shoreline where they're actually holding the soil in place and preventing that erosion from occurring. We also see with mangroves direct benefit in wind and wave reduction during tropical storm events. So we will find as much as 60% wind and wave energy reduction during a tropical storm. We think about some of the areas in Southwest Florida that were hit by, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Ian, and you can see how quickly storms kind of lose their oomph once they run into a large area of mangroves. It just kind of acts like a sponge and takes a lot of that energy out of the system. We talked about the critical habitat that mangroves provide, but what I didn't talk about before is carbon dioxide sequestration. So mangroves are actually more efficient at CO2 sequestration than a tropical rainforest, as much as 10 times as much. And so this is reflected in their ability to store carbon not only if any kind of development is occurring in and around mangroves. So I want to ask what did I miss? Go ahead and type it in the chat if there's something that you think I missed related to mangroves. I'll say the thing that we don't talk about enough is the recreational opportunities that we find in our mangrove systems. They are kind of a key component of ecotourism operations where folks rent kayaks, canoes, paddleboards, and go through mangrove tunnels, right? They really provide an aesthetic that we don't find in many other places in Florida. So they could be a great way to kind of highlight and showcase what Florida really can look like. Let's see what we got. Stephanie said aesthetics. Yep. Good. Yes. Yeah. Sense of place, I think. Characterization of places, like Stephanie said, a sense of place can be really tied to the predominant tree species that are there. And mangroves absolutely can provide that sense of place. I took this photo on this slide at Emerson Point Preserve in Manatee County. And I actually have a great photo. This is way bigger than you think it is. I have a picture of my son climbing on these roots. And I associate certain places with these kind of skeletal root structures that these red mangroves provide. And they really do provide that kind of characterization of a place. So understanding then the role that mangroves play in the ecosystem, I think we can recognize why they're protected. And these protections extend, all the way from the local level up to national protections related to the National Wetlands Rule. We have here in Florida, before there was a Department of Environmental Protection, there was the DNR, the Department of Natural Resources. And in the 1970s, there were some efforts through the DNR and the water management districts to start to regulate mangroves and their trimming and removal. And if it was kind of agreed that there needed to be some kind of statewide rule related to this. And so they started working on something, and eventually from about 1975 to 1996, they eventually figured out what to do. And we ended up with the 1996 Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act. And this act has been amended, I think, once since it was signed into law. And I'll talk a little bit about that amendment in a little bit. But essentially, this law sets up a framework that says, okay, we have people who own property on the water. They need to be able to see the water, like they have a riparian right to view. But we also recognize the value and importance of mangroves, and they need to be protected from unregulated defoliation or removal. So the state law sets up this framework by which it says, okay, DEP, you need to figure out how people are going to trim or remove mangroves, and where it's necessary, where it's not, and what kind of mitigation may be required. So the state kind of set up their framework for permitting. And then within the state law, there is the opportunity for local governments to receive what's called delegation, which just means that the administration of the rule moves from the DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection, to that local management authority. In that delegation process, all of the state exemption criteria have to remain the same, but the individual authority can set up their own permit requirements, permit structure, costs for permits, whether or not the trimmers have to be registered, etc. At my last look, I think there were 7 locally delegated governments in the state, and they all have similar but slightly different permit criteria related to mangrove trimming. Now, you may wonder, why do we need to talk about this at a state level? Mangroves are only found in certain parts of the state. Well, something about mangroves that's interesting from a historical perspective is that we actually have kind of geologic record of mangroves as far north as portions of Georgia. And so we know that their historical range went further than it currently does. And we can being very, they're very prolific, and they're much more successful at germination. So red mangroves are being found up in the Apalachicola area of Florida, all the way up into kind of the Jacksonville area, and then further into the coast of Georgia, and even just barely into the coast of South Carolina at this point. So you can see here, this chart shows you kind of where mangroves have been moving and the tracking of their movement. There is a mangrove migration network, which is a regional collaborative that's kind of tracking and mapping this northward progress of mangroves. So if you don't have them yet, you might have them soon. So for you all, for this audience, I recognized some fellow arborists in the audience, those folks whose names I recognize. And in talking with John prior, a lot of you are either working professional arborists, or you're doing some kind of consultancy, or maybe you work for a municipality, right? And so wherever you work, the mangrove exemption criteria has to remain the same, right? And so that's what I'm going to talk about now, is just some of the mangrove exemption criteria. And then if you're working within a specific municipality, you're going to want to reach out to them to find out what their rules are. And so for exemptions, right, you can trim mangroves on private property where mangroves are taller than 10 feet from the substrate and aren't trimmed below 6 feet from the substrate. That's their overall height, okay? But then, of course, there's a whole bunch of criteria that go along with that. The shoreline length, oops, sorry. Just so that you know, we're no longer under a lightning alert. um, So we have all these additional criteria that go along with these exemptions. So we have shoreline length. The property has to be 0 to 150 feet, can be trimmed by a homeowner or PMT depending on the height. We'll look at a diagram on the next page that talks about the height. If the shoreline is greater than 150 feet in length, then only 65% of those mangroves can be trimmed under an exemption. If you want to trim more of them, that falls into permit kind of permit territory there. The depth of mangroves along that shoreline have to be less than 50 feet, and they have to meet this state definition of a riparian mangrove fringe. So that means that they can't be discontinuous from the shoreline. There can't be mangroves and then a salt marsh wetland and then a shoreline. They have to be within that 50-foot margin, and they have to meet that definition of riparian mangrove fringe. As for the height, anything less than 6 feet is not allowed unless it was previously authorized, and you have to have a signed affidavit showing that it was previously authorized. Okay, so just in general, think about that picture I showed at the beginning, right? Red mangroves, the state champion is 64 feet tall. If you're cutting this thing to 5 feet, right, that's not great. So generally anything below 6 feet is disallowed. There are special circumstances where they can be, but again, there must be a signed affidavit that allows that to happen. Between 6 and 10 feet, if I were a private property owner and I had a mangrove fringe that was 30 feet deep and my shoreline was 75 feet long, I could go out to that shoreline and I could cut the mangroves myself as long as they didn't go below 6 feet and they weren't taller than 10 feet to begin with. If they're between 10 and 16 feet, they're going to need to hire a professional mangrove trimmer. Who's a professional mangrove trimmer? Talk about that on the next slide, but you probably are, even if you don't know it. Anything that's taller than 16 feet is going to need a professional mangrove trimmer, and the trimming has to be staged so that no more than 25% of the foliage is removed annually. And then anything above 24 feet is going to require a permit. Okay, so if the tree is 30 feet tall when you get to it, then that tree is going to need a permit to be trimmed. Now, I want to put a couple of pruning reminders here, right? You all are familiar with these, but red mangroves in particularly are really susceptible to bark tearing. So wherever you can, try to make sure that you're following appropriate pruning practices to make sure that you keep that bark intact. Another consideration, there was a literature review that was done a couple years ago, and based on all of the available science, red mangrove branches, we really shouldn't be trimming things that are much more than 2.5 centimeters in diameter. Red mangroves are much more susceptible to damage and are less likely to handle that pruning damage well compared to black mangroves and white mangroves. When you're thinking about what time of year to prune, generally, because Florida is constantly growing, you can prune any time of year, but there are certain times of year when the mangroves are flowering that you want to avoid pruning so that they can generate their propagules and allow them and release them into the waters. So generally, white and black mangroves are flowering and fruiting between March and July. And some of them are a little bit later. I saw some that were still in fruit just a few days ago. And then red mangroves actually flower and fruit all year round, but they tend to be more active in the summer months. You can find propagules and flowers on red mangroves at the same time most of the year, but generally they're more active in the summertime. So who is a professional mangrove trimmer? Well, anybody who's an ISA certified arborist is technically considered a professional mangrove trimmer by the state law. You can also be considered a PMT if you're a professional wetland scientist, a certified environmental professional, a certified ecologist, or a landscape architect. Now, this is the amendment that I wanted to mention. So originally, the state law just said landscape architect, but they added in an amendment that has some training required for landscape architects before they're considered a PMT now. Delegated local governments may have additional requirements. You can ask to be added to the DEP's list of PMTs that they maintain on their webpage. So you can see the link there. If you're not on that list and you think you should be, you contact the DEP and they can add you to that list. Many of the locally delegated governments will require you to register with that locally delegated government if you're doing permitted mangrove work. I think Sarasota County was like 25 bucks a year. I think Pinellas County is somewhere around the same. And you may have to go through some additional training in those locally delegated governments, and then it's an annual registration. And that just says like, hey, I know what I'm doing. I am going to submit permit applications to you so that I can trim mangroves. And again, this is going to come into play when you're on properties that are greater than 150 feet in length, or the mangroves are greater than 10 feet in height. And if they're greater than 24 feet in height, you absolutely have to apply for a permit. But generally, my recommendation to any arborist who is touching mangroves is to contact the local government, make sure that you're allowed to do what you're going to do, ask that property owner to provide, even if they tell you, oh, I have an exemption, or, oh, I have a previous permit, you ask them to provide that proof to you. You keep a copy of it. You take pictures before and after, and you contact all the people you need to contact so that you know that you're in the clear. I've heard from more than a few individuals saying that they were contacted to come out and do mangrove work. They weren't able to get the verification they needed regarding a permit or an exemption, and they walked away from the job only to have the DEP come after them because the homeowner or property owner kind of threw them under the bus after they went and hired, Chuck with a truck to come in and do the trimming. So definitely, dot all your I's, cross all your T's, get all of that paperwork before you engage with mangrove trimming. Here are some phone numbers for South, Southeast, Southwest, Central districts for the DEP. We aren't likely to have anybody from Northeast or Northwest district here, but these are the numbers. You're likely in South District or Southeast or Southwest. And those are going to be the numbers you call to contact the DEP. If you're in a locally delegated government, like let's say you're in Miami-Dade or you're in Sarasota, you're going to contact the locally delegated government. And then you may also just want to contact the DEP just in case. It depends on how good the communication is between those two agencies. Just as a reminder, you all know this, but mangroves may or may not have a branch bark ridge. So when you're doing your trimming on mangroves, right, we want to try to follow proper arboricultural practices when we're doing our trimming, because these are trees. As much as people like to take hedge trimmers to them, I cringe every time. But sometimes that's the only way to accomplish what the property owner wants. But in general, it may be more difficult to distinguish that branch bark ridge. So just, kind of follow the best rule of thumb you can related to proper pruning, and remember that red mangroves tend to have their bark bare. We all know this, right? We don't want to be conducting flush cuts. Mangroves can be susceptible to some diseases. They do tend to have pretty high resiliency to pests and fungi. There are some organisms that have been found to impact mangroves, but they're more often problematic for young mangroves than they are for adult mangrove or for mature mangroves. So there was an issue with some fungal pathogens in some nurseries in Southeast Florida about a year ago. And those were primarily, it's a suite of fungi that are found in natural systems, but generally they aren't a problem for a healthy, mature mangrove. They just were kind of proliferating in this environment where there were a lot of young mangroves, and they were able to damage a lot of young mangroves that were being used in restoration projects. If you are interested in learning more about that, I do have a fact sheet that I did on that, and I can send that to John, and he can share that with you all. So, why should you care about how mangroves are taken care of? Obviously, you live in Florida for a reason. That's my kayak. I love spending time on the water in and around mangroves, right? We recognize their value from a recreational perspective, from a shoreline protection perspective. And the photo on the right is just a reminder that even if you don't have mangroves yet, if you live in salt marsh predominated areas, we are tracking their northward migration, and you can expect to see them sometime in your area. So, they perform key ecological functions. They have a lot of importance to us from an economic perspective as a state that relies on tourism and fisheries for a lot of our income. And so, we have lots of reasons why we should care. But I also think they're beautiful, and we generally should take care of them because they provide a lot of aesthetic value to our landscape. Remember, red mangroves have the pencil-like propagules, brown at one end, green at the other. White mangroves have the round leaves, often with a little notch in the tip. And then black mangroves are characterized by those pneumatophores that reach up out of the soil, and they're salt encrusted leaves. Okay, so that's our three species. There's a funny little kids rhyme. If it helps you remember, it's red, red, pointy head, black, black, lick the back, and white, white, Frankenstein bolts on tight, because of the little nectaries on the petiole. So fun little rhyme if it helps you remember. Also remember that mangroves are trees. When we look at kind of best options from an ecological perspective, a window trim or vista trim is generally going to be the best for maintaining an upper canopy, a lower canopy, while still providing for a view. They provide habitat for a million billion things that are really essential for us and interesting. And you can look up historical permits if you want some help in learning how to do that through the state's DEP direct map. I'm happy to provide you with some information on how to do that. And remember to cover your butt if you're doing trimming. Ask to see proof, take pictures, get documentation, make sure that you're doing everything you need to protect the resource, but also to protect yourself as a business professional. All right. And with that, I will be conducting a day-long mangrove workshop in Hillsborough County on November 3rd. Watch Eventbrite for that registration. We're still looking for a location and finalizing the agenda, but there will hopefully be some CEUs associated with it. If not pre-approved, certainly you'll be able to submit for some post-approval ISA CEUs for that workshop, again, on November 3rd. And that's my email address, and I'm always happy to answer emails, and that's what I have for you. I'm going to stop my share so you can ask questions if you want to.
Yeah, so if anybody that's still hanging out here, if you've got questions, you can either put them in the chat, or you can go ahead and just unmute yourselves and just ask directly here. And I think that there was a little bit in the chat here.
Yeah, there's a few in the chat. So dead mangrove branches, can a property owner cut them off? No. Dead and live mangrove are considered the same under the state law. If the mangrove is greater than 10 feet in height, they would need a PMT to prune those branches. I know it sounds silly, but that's how the state law treats mangrove, whether dead or live, it's the same. Can you remove an isolated group of mangroves next to a retaining wall? No. You would need a permit to remove those mangroves, especially if you're removing and not replanting anywhere. Unless they're in an upland area, discontinuous from any kind of shoreline. I've had some instances where there are some like stormwater ponds that are slightly brackish and have mangroves around them. Those don't meet the definition of a riparian mangrove fringe according to the state law. And so in those cases, those mangroves can be removed. But again, I would still just contact people just in case, because some local governments may have native plant protections, or that may be a buffer of some sort that's required by law. So there could be overlapping agencies with rules related to those mangroves. So always double check with anybody who could be responsible for that. Question about the northward migration.
I'm
So
gonna go
again,
ahead and
remember,
share in the chat too here, like the post. So just so that like while you're doing Q&A here, just letting everybody know.
okay. Um, so let's see. ISA arborists can trim mangroves without any additional licensing or training. Yes, certified arborists, yes. Now, if you're within a locally delegated government, you may need to register with that locally delegated government. But according to the state law, you're considered a PMT if you're an ISA certified arborist. Question about the northward migration of mangroves. Right, we saw an update in 2023 to the USDA hardiness zones map. Mangroves are limited northward by cold temperature. So when we see a shift in our hardiness zones, like we did here in the state of Florida, Hillsborough County went from 9A, 9B to 10A, 10B in most parts of the county. And that's related to that coldest overnight temperature for a 20-year period. So that's what we're looking at there. And remember that historic range, there have been geologic records showing mangroves into Georgia in some portions of our history. So it's not outside of their historic geological range. Good question, Joe. Mark, I'm going to get to you in just a second. Sorry. Actually, I'm going to let Mark go because I think Joe came in the chat after you. So go ahead, Mark.
I just wanted to thank you for a very thorough and complete, accurate delivery today. I believe I met you in Sarasota County when I went over there to get registered in Sarasota County, not the city of Sarasota, which I learned over there.
Yes.
And thank you very much. I'm still doing it, and here we are.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark.
Yeah.
Let's see. Question from Joe is, what are the heights measured from? Yeah, it's the substrate. So it's not from the top of the roots, you measure from the substrate. So the height, you may be below water, especially at high tide, measuring to the top. And again, that's the average overall height of the canopy. Mark's question, are there any active state or county initiatives for expanding mangroves? We've actually been doing, there are several mangrove planting programs that have been conducted here in Hillsborough County, along with several that are being initiated by volunteer organizations and nonprofits in the area as well. So I know in my area, there are quite a few mangrove restoration projects that are ongoing. I'm sure there are some near you as well.
All right, we got 21 on the poll here, so I'll go ahead and share the results. Are you able to see, Alyssa?
Yeah.
I'm gonna go ahead and lead the little post hoc discussion here on the review.
Sure. So good job on the first two. 100% of you got the first two correct. So we see which of the following is not a benefit, right? Increased freshwater availability. Mangroves don't have anything to do with the production of freshwater. Which of the following mangrove species is not protected? Buttonwood, right? Buttonwood is on global lists of species and is considered a mangrove by the IUCN, but it is not considered a mangrove here in the state of Florida, right? So buttonwood, very good. Last one. So who is authorized to trim mangroves taller than 16 feet? So those of you who selected C, a professional mangrove trimmer with staged trimming, you are correct. Between 16 and 24 feet in height, those mangroves have to be staged, where only 25% of the foliage is removed in each trimming event. All right. So great job, everybody. And I really enjoyed talking to you today. John, have me back for another one.
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
May I ask another question?
Yeah.
I've had some mangroves closely associated with stormwater runoff. Would you consider that a utility application, or I was wondering how it related to that freshwater question, really.
Yeah. So something interesting.
I got frozen. I don't know if that's a local issue or her issue.
Yeah, she's showing up frozen for me too. So maybe
Okay.
maybe we'll just give it a second. I noticed it was happening a little bit
Yeah, in the
during your presentation.
presentation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good job though. Well done, John.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm
Well,
just trying to bring the relevant stuff here.
yeah,
So,
there's a lot of it.
oh,
And this is a hot ticket item, certainly.
uh-oh. Let's see if she pops back in.
Sounded like she was in a storm area or something happening over there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, who knows what I mean, if she
Solar flares, John. Come on.
I know. I saw that in the news. So, um yeah, if she doesn't come back in like 30, 40 seconds, we'll go ahead and just call it. And I would just follow up with her, like via her email.
You understand? I mean, that's how I promote them. That I do have where there's a large stand and it's very downhill and downstream from a development and that sort of thing. It's all natural grade, so it is a utility service, clearing the water and all the nitrogen fixing, et cetera, on the way out into the bay. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's not part of a regulation yet. I don't think anybody's, got data on it that you must keep so much, some particular numbers.
Yeah.
You had a good turnout today.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just, just trying, like I said, just bringing what people want to see.
Yeah.
So, well, I don't think we're gonna get her back, and I think that yeah, we were seeing that she was having problems there.
Yeah.
So, but she's over
Yeah.
in your guys' side of the state, so I'm sure she might make it down to Sarasota again too. So, but I guess with that, just wanted to say thanks for everybody showing up. Next month we're gonna cover ecosystem services. So I mean, kind of trying like to make sense of which trees are going to be most impactful in terms of like their environmental influence in urban areas. And we'll get into like how the scientists look at it and what managers can do like to best manage for that as well. So with that, hope everybody takes care, and hopefully we'll catch you all down the road here.
And this recording will be available. You'll send out a link.
Yes, sir. I'll
Later
follow
on.
up. Anyone who's registered, so even folks that weren't able to make it, anyone that went through the registration process, like we'll get a link here. We'll follow up via email. And
Excellent.
yeah, anyone that needs CEUs, you should have at some point put CEU information into when you registered and things like that. If I run into any issues, I follow up with everybody individually. I should at least have your emails. So I can do that too, and that sometimes happens if there's complications. But so take care, everybody. We'll catch you
Excellent.
down the road here.
Thank you.